Hey everyone.
Hi. So today we're going to be talking about V4 hooks and app-specific sequencing. This is.
We already.
Oh, actually, we already. Know.
So today we're briefly going to touch upon what the problem is, and then what app-specific sequencing is, and then we'll discuss how Angstrom leverages app-specific sequencing to solve a lot of these problems. So what's the problem? Imagine a scenario in which a large exchange, like the New York Stock Exchange, gave up its control of the order book to a single market maker, right? I think we could all agree that that would be quite absurd. This market maker could, in this example, order the trades that are coming into the order book at will, and then include or exclude whichever one they want. Obviously, this would result in quite a big of a loss of equal access to the trading infrastructure. It would also make the market far less transparent, and there's an inherent conflict of interest in a single market maker having the responsibility to order these transactions and trades fairly. Well, although this example sounds quite ridiculous, if we look at Ethereum today, that's kind of what's going on. On decentralized exchanges on Ethereum, these builders, which for a few of them are very sophisticated trading shops, have the sequencing rights. And naturally, their incentive is not to order trades fairly, because there is value to be extracted in manipulating which orders get included and where in the block they actually get included. And this, we've kind of seen this in the whole verticalization of the builders and searchers and the resulting MEV, sandwiching and sextex arbitrage. So yeah, the existing decentralized exchange, implementation is broken not because of the exchange itself and the rules that it enforces, rather because it lacks control. It doesn't have the ability to ensure that the user interactions that want to interact with its smart contract are sequenced in a way that is fair.
So this gets into the solution of app-specific sequencing. And I'm sure a lot of you guys might be asking, well, what is this thing called app-specific sequencing, which some people might like to call it ASS. So, okay, it's a bit hard to see on the screen, but this is just a rough overview of a transaction supply chain without ASS. We have a public mempool, private mempool, order flow getting aggregated, going through the builders, and then run a PBS auctions at relay, then get to the proposers at the end. So that is the current existing pipeline. Now, with ASS, we would see app-specific mempool on top of the private and public mempool. And this mempool will be specific to, in this case, application, our Angstrom hook. And accompanied with it, we have Angstrom network that is going to be doing this sequencing work underneath. And for all of the sequencing work, generates an Angstrom bundle, a big fat bundle that gets submitted to the builders and then go through the rest of the PBS supply chain. So without getting into too much details, one of the few of the key properties that I want to really emphasize here today is three things. One, ASS allows smart contract state locks. Essentially, this means that a contract will be able to designate a certain groups of sequencer who are permissioned or who are allowed under certain condition, maybe some stake or whatever, to update the state contract. This would also lead to the next part, which is that app-specific mempools. Because there are a set of people who can update the smart contract state, then we will also form an app-specific mempool where we can aggregate the flow that is specific to our protocols, the Angstrom protocols. And then lastly, and most importantly, order-agnostic outcomes. What this means is that when we do the sequencing for our smart contract, for our order flow, we will have it in a way that is specific to our protocol and in a bundle that cannot be altered, modified by any other parties when it's submitted to the builders. Therefore, whatever builders do within the block is essentially irrelevant, or rather, our bundle will be agnostic to the ordering that is enforced by the block builders in the PBS supply chain. So what does that mean? It means that AS brings back sovereignty to dApps. So how does app gain sovereignty? Well, because now application can sequence their own order flow and transactions, they now would have sovereignty over sequencing and therefore the implied execution of all those transactions. And gaining sovereignty over those also means that now they have some sort of sovereignty over the state that the contracts are based on. And this sovereignty enables protocols like us to optimize the economic payoff of users. In our case, LPs and swappers. And when we say like optimize the economic payoff, it just means that we want them to get a better execution and get more profit out of the operation that they do or liquidity provision that they do on Angstrom. So this begs another question, which is why not an app chain, like an L1 or L2, like a rollup? I'm sure many of you guys see them popping up quite a lot of places there. This is just like an overview. I know it's very small, so it's a bit hard to see, and I will kind of summarize it in a more succinct fashion. Essentially, what the difference of AS compared to other L1, L2 app chain is that app-specific sequencing is agnostic of the execution environment, meaning that this sequencing can be, I guess, integrated in any layer 1 or layer 2 as you wish, which also means that you have an ease of access to the native liquidity and order flow within that chain, within that ecosystem. And in our case, we're first deploying on V4 Hook and on L1, so now we have ease of access to the liquidity on L1. No need for bridging. No need for bridging. Second, because it's living on whichever execution environment, you also inherit the liveness of that chain L1 that you're based on. And in our case, we're based on Ethereum, so we inherit the liveness of Ethereum. If our sequencers goes down, for example, the app-specific sequencer, the assets doesn't have to be frozen like the way it would for L2's app chains, right? So that's another one. And then lastly, no execution overhead. And one of the biggest confusion that people may have is that, oh, is AS not just another rollup? No. We are not executing state transition functions of any sorts. We are simply just sequencing transaction in an application-specific fashion such that there's no fraud proof, there's no ZKP, there's nothing that we're really trying to verify to the settlement layer Ethereum, and we're simply just sequencing it, and therefore no execution overhead. And that's, in my opinion, also a very big overhead that many application chains have to bear with and pay the cost for. So Ludwig will go through the Angstrom Hook implementation.
So now we can kind of shift towards a concrete example and implementation and kind of see what this app-specific sequencing model enables. To give you kind of a high-level overview of what the trading flow and just like the usage of the application looks like, it's quite a bit different than a regular smart contract, as you could probably infer. Because there's the state of the smart contract that is gated, users aren't submitting regular transactions. They're actually submitting intents, limit orders that are signed to the network, and then those intents get gossiped around across the validators within our network. These gossiped orders are then collected by a randomly selected proposer, or really like the leader of that round of our consensus. The leader will then sequence it and optimistically submit it on-chain. That submission will then be verified post-execution by the rest of the validators to ensure that the sequencing rules have been respected. And there are a few steps in between in terms of the rounds of consensus that enable us to have censorship-resistant properties so you can't really manipulate the outcome. In terms of more specifics on the sequencing rules, we run two processes in parallel. The first is the arbitrage auction. So this is the auction to rebalance the pool back to the fair market value of the asset. And it's very simple. It's a first price auction. Arbitrageurs send in their bids, and they are bidding for the right to execute against the AMM's current state, that is, at a 0% trading fee. And so here, with a competitive auction, we can recapture a bulk of the value that was leaked to these rebalancing events, to these arbitrage events when there's significant market shifts in prices, and we can distribute that pro rata back to the LPs, and exactly back to the LPs that provided that liquidity, that facilitated that arbitrage in the first place. Secondly, and this is kind of a tiny bit more confusing, I must admit, is the batch auction that provides a uniform clearing price. And so here, after this AMM pool has been rebalanced, what we're able to do is we're able to represent this AMM as a bunch of limit orders. And so we can combine a bunch of these limit orders of the AMM and the limit orders that have been sent by users or market makers into a single book. And what that enables us to do is we can kind of interpret them as a supply and demand curve and identify the point of intersection. And so what that point of intersection gives us is a single fair price that the entire batch should be clearing at. So here it's a bit cut off, but looking into more specifics on the order propagation and consensus, here you have the centralized exchange on the left, the searcher that is streaming the trades and new quotes that have occurred on the centralized exchange. They realize that there's an arbitrage opportunity. The AMM is no longer balanced. It is no longer in line with the market price. So they will send a Sextex arbitrage bid, where they're communicating how much they're willing to pay for the right to execute. And then that gets gossiped across the network of validators. For regular users or market makers, it's the same process. You kind of just remove the centralized exchange, and here you're just submitting a transaction, a limit order, to be able to trade. In terms of the on-chain execution, and this is kind of where we get to dig a bit deeper into how this works with Uniswap v4, so yeah, basically the leader will then submit that transaction to a builder and the public mempool for execution. The pool hook will verify that the sender is a validator within our network that has stake, so that we can ensure that not any random person is executing and there isn't bypassability of the auction. Once the sender has been verified, we then execute the swap. So here what's kind of nice with having all of this off-chain infrastructure is that you can compress down all of these user actions. You don't have to have multiple individual swaps for a single pool. You can net all of them out and ensure that you're only taking a single swap against the AMM. And that results in quite dramatic gas savings. Finally, after we've pulled the liquidity, pulled the limit order liquidity that was being sent as limit orders off-chain into the smart contract and settled everything, we ensure that all of the intents are validated on-chain, otherwise the entire bundle reverts. So in terms of trust guarantees here, you're not trusting this off-chain network and have the risk of getting rugged or getting sandwiched in any form of way. Your limit order, in the same way as a regular Uniswap swap, is enforced on-chain. And then looking into these gas savings, we can kind of see the difference in gas costs compared to a baseline Uniswap v3 swap, depending on the number of orders in the batch. So HF here means a high frequency order. Really, all that is trades that are using internal balances, so balances that you've deposited into our hook smart contract to avoid the transfer overhead. And then the retail orders assume that you have liquid tokens in your address and that you incur that transfer overhead. And in terms of with and without the AMM, here the difference there is at times the orders can be perfectly netted out and you actually don't need to pull liquidity from the AMM, so you don't incur that overhead. So as we can see, we're basically always better than a Uniswap v3 pool in terms of cost, except in a scenario where you're swapping against the AMM with a single order, HF or retail. But we wanted to be as fair as possible in our comparison with v3, so we did not include the router overhead that you would normally incur. So if we take into account the router, you actually end up with close to 1-to-1 and a slight advantage to us in terms of gas overhead. And